And we are live on YouTube. And I'm going to let everybody in. Good evening, everyone. This is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Just letting everybody in the door. Welcome. Just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Thanks for joining. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes and we'll get started. All right, I guess we will get started. We're going up in numbers pretty quick. If you're just joining us, this is the Montgomery County Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. My name is Matt Losack. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Renters Alliance. With our staff, David Mullins, our outreach director, Emily Towie, outreach coordinator, Tim Wong, our outreach coordinator, Melek Demir, an outreach coordinator, and Pat Beckham, also an outreach coordinator, doing our work for us. And I'm also pleased to have with us Max Wilberg and Brian Piat, who are with the Renters Alliance Service Year Program, part of Governor Wes Moore's Maryland Service Year Program. This is their first job and their first few weeks with us, and we're glad to have them, and they're helping us do our outreach door to door in buildings across Montgomery County. And the more they learn about renters' rights and the resources available to renters, the more you're going to see them out there, and hopefully at one time, maybe even running meetings like this. And we have special guests with us tonight on a very important topic that will keep coming up as we get used to this program, which is new, which is the rent stabilization program. As many of you know, that actually the law was passed over a year ago, but actually took effect in July. And with that legislation came the formation of the Office of Rent Stabilization. And so with us, we have the manager of the Office of Rent Stabilization, Paulina Melvin, and the program manager for rent stabilization, Sharon Wilkerson, who will be giving us an overview of the program, which we'll keep having to tell people over and over again what it is, how it works, what the law is. But then also, since they're coming back, this is the second time that they're with us, to go over some of the nuances that have been cropping up, some of the confusion and some of the new information about when properties can be exempt, under what circumstances, what fees may be coming in that people don't understand whether they're legal or not, and so on. And then an opportunity for everybody to ask questions. So let's get right into it and turn it over to Paulina Melvin and Sharon Wilkerson. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you, Matt.
Sorry, 1 second. Needed to, can you all see my screen? Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. As Matt mentioned, my name is Sharon Wilkerson. I am the the program manager for the Office of Rent Stabilization. And I have my manager here, Paulina Melvin. So today I'm just here to give you an overview of the program. We encourage you to ask questions. Paulina, as I'm going through the presentation, please put your questions into the chat. Paulina will try to answer those as I go along, and then we'll also have a question and answer period at the end. Just quickly, are you guys seeing the full presentation or like the presentation view? I'm sorry, I'm on two screens
It's the
right
presentation view, Sharon, so we can
Sorry.
see on the side. Yep. Okay, so just
Let me
nope.
do it this way.
There's your vacation pictures.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. It always can get kind of weird. Okay,
There we
now
go.
We still
Yes.
can see
the presentation view. Okay, what
the
I'll do is
presentation, then we see next slide. So like a preview of the next slide. So I think if you click on
I'm
display
sorry, what I'm
settings.
going to do is, I apologize. I'm just going to use one, disconnect my screens so you can
That
see
was
one
perfect.
screen. And that'll take the issue away. Here we are.
Perfect. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, thank you. So just jumping right into it. As Matt has already said, rent stabilization was introduced to Montgomery County through Bill 1523. It was signed into law last year, and the executive regulation was approved this summer on July 23rd. Among the purposes are protecting tenants against rent increases above a certain limit, as well as allowing avenues for landlords to increase their rents to achieve fair return or to cover things such as capital improvements. So we'll go right into what is the actual allowable rent increase. So the rent increase is determined by an equation. That equation is the urban wage, the index for the urban wage earners in the DC area plus 3%. Or 6%, so whichever is less. So for example, this year, the CPIU is 3.3%. So 3.3 plus 3% is 6.3, which means that this year's maximum rent increase allowance will be limited to 6%. So DHCA, we will publish this allowable rent increase and the CPIU each year. Those numbers are valid for 12 months. So from July 1st to June 30th of the following year. Montgomery County requires a notice of rent increase to be sent to the tenant from the landlord. So if you have received if you received an increase that was sent before July 23rd, that went into effect after that date in July, and that increase is over the allowable 6%, that increase is no longer valid, and your landlord has two options to fix that. They can either amend the notice, and so just send an amendment with the correct increase, and that would keep the original date of the increase, or the landlord can void the notice entirely and then issue a new increase, which would have a new 90-day period, 90-day notice for the increase. I noticed someone's hand is raised. If you have a question, please put it in the chat, and Paulina will answer it there for you. So in the cases of new leases or lease renewals, for rent stabilized units, they're only permitted one increase per 12-month period. For multi-year leases of rent stabilized units, the annual increase for the first year applies to the entirety of the lease term. So say, for example, your lease ends in December of this year, you're paying $1,200. The landlord sends a notice of renewal, a notice of the rent increase with the option of a 2-year renewal. So the increase for this year is 6%. So your new rent would be $1,272. And the landlord offers the option for a 2-year renewal. If you choose a 2-year renewal, the rent increase for your first year applies to the entire lease term. So that means that if you sign the lease for 2 years, your rent for the next 2 years will be $1,272. The landlord is not allowed to increase the rent for the second year. Now, we do allow landlords to bank any unused rent for future increases. So we define the banked amount as specifically the dollar amount of an annual rent increase allowance the landlord did not use to increase the rent for a regulated unit. So the example we have here is, so say your current rent is $1,200. The allowable increase is 6%, which is $72. For whatever reason, you and your landlord have a good relationship, you have extenuating circumstances or anything like that. Your landlord decides instead of 6%, they only want to increase the rent by 5%. So that would be $60. That means that your landlord has an unused $12 of banked rent that they can use for future increases. Now, when your landlord is calculating your annual rent increase, they are supposed to calculate it by using the base rent, so the amount you're currently being charged, plus the allowable increase, so that is the CPIU plus 3% or 6%, plus any banked amount. Now, the sum of those three things can be no more than 10% of the base rent, so no more than 10% of what you're currently being charged. And that's just to ensure that, say, for example, you have a landlord who's been banking rent for many, many years. Say they've been banking rent for 7 to 10 years. That's just to ensure that the landlord isn't imposing that full banked rent on one tenant at one time. So now I want to touch on increases for vacant units and previously vacant units. So we'll talk about 2 points in time here. We'll talk about units that became vacant after the regulation went into effect, so after July 23rd of this year. And then we'll talk about units that were vacant before the regulation went into effect, so before July 23rd, 2024. So if there is a unit that was vacant, that became vacant after the regulation went into effect, so after July 23rd, the landlord is allowed to increase the rent up to the banked amount or to no more than the base rent at the time the unit was last occupied, plus any allowable increase. So for example, you have a tenant who was paying $1,200. They move out in August, so after the regulation went into effect. The landlord has a new tenant coming in mid-August. The allowable rent increase for this year is 6%. So that means that the landlord may charge up to $1,272 in rent for the new lease. So the other side of that scenario is units that were vacant before regulation went into effect, so before July 23rd, 2024. In this case, the landlord is allowed to set the base rent at whatever amount they desire when they return it to the market. However, after that initial lease up, all future increases must be in line with the executive regulation. So we have another example, the same tenant, instead of moving out August 1st, they're now moving out July 1st, so before the regulation went into effect. The landlord would still like to rent the unit in mid-August. The only difference is now that since the unit became vacant before the regulations went into effect, the landlord may set the base rent at whatever they desire, so whatever amount. But again, any future increases must be in line with the executive regulation. So not every rental unit in Montgomery County will be under rent stabilization. There are some conditions that would exempt a unit. So this is the full list here. I won't go through all of them individually, but I did want to touch on a few. So the first would be a newly constructed unit that has been offered for rent for less than 23 years. So that means that so this year is 2024. So that means that all units 2001 and after are exempt from rent control. From rent stabilization, excuse me. Next year will be 2025. So all units 2002 and after will be exempt from rent stabilization. So that means that each year there are more units that are falling into regulation and under stabilization.
Sharon, can I just rephrase that one time, just so
Sure.
I know how I hear it? So if your building is qualified, is more than 2 units, and it was built 22 years ago, it has 1 year of exemption. If it's
Yes.
built this year, it's got 23 years of exemption. Okay,
Yes.
so just keep that in mind. There, we do have some buildings that were built 22 years ago that are going to be 23 years come January, and they will be under the program when that happens.
Thank you, Matt. So the second one I want to touch on is a unit owned by a natural person or the trust or estate of a decedent, so someone who's no longer here, who owns 2 or fewer rental properties within the county. So these would be more scenarios where, you know, say there's your landlord owns their own home and then they have a condo that they're renting out to you. Since their home is their primary residence, they then have 1 rental unit. So they would be exempt from rent stabilization. But the key point here is that that unit must be owned by a natural person. So if John Smith, the landlord, owns his residential home and then also has the condo that he's renting out to you that's under John Smith, the person, he would be exempt from rent stabilization. However, if your landlord one day decides, I no longer want the condo under my name, I would like to put it under, you know, John Smith LLC, so JS LLC, that unit is no longer owned by a natural person and therefore would not be exempt from rent stabilization. They would have to follow the regulation. The last one I want to touch on here is the third bullet point. So a unit subject to a regulatory agreement with a governmental agency that restricts the unit to low and moderate income tenants. So these are things like LIHTC, any AMI restricted units. These are not for tenant-based programs like Housing Choice Voucher. So the key thing to remember here is that if the unit itself has restrictions for income or restricts the unit to low or moderate income individuals, that unit itself is exempt from rent stabilization. However, if a tenant themselves has a voucher or anything like that and puts it into a regular unit, that unit may still be, if that unit could still fall under rent stabilization. So just in review, before we move forward, I want to do a quick comparison between the rent increases allowed for regulated units versus exempt units. So again, in review, the rent for regulated units, the increase is limited to the CPIU plus 3% or 6%, whichever amount is less. For regulated units, the rent may only be increased once per 12-month period, except for multi-year leases, which must have the same rent for the entire lease term. So, for example, there is a unit who the rent was increased on January 1st, 2025. The tenant moves out when their lease ends on June 2nd. Because this is a stabilized unit, the landlord may not increase the rent for the new tenant moving in. They must wait at least 12 months. So they must wait until January 1st of the 2026 of the following year to increase the rent. And it's also important to know that increases on regulated units may only be applied to a new lease or at the time of a renewal. No mid-lease increases are permitted. So on the other hand, for exempt units are permitted to increase the rent by any amount. DHCA does not have any authority to dictate that. However, our recommendation has always been that landlords use the voluntary rent guidelines to determine the rent increase. For tenants in exempt units, the rent may only be increased once per 12-month period, but the landlord may increase the rent for a new lease. So the example we have here is the rent for the unit was increased on January 1st. The tenant moves out in June. However, since this unit is exempt from rent stabilization, the landlord would be permitted to increase the rent when the new tenant moves in, regardless if it's been 12 months or not. For exempt units, increases may only be applied to a lease at the time of a new lease or at a lease renewal. No mid-lease increases are permitted unless it is a multi-year lease. So multi-year leases for exempt units are permitted an increase for the second year or for one of the following years. So as I previously mentioned, Montgomery County requires notices for rent increases. The increases must be in writing and delivered by U.S. mail. If not delivered by U.S. mail, they must be delivered in person, and the landlord must have a signed signature receipt, and the notice must also be sent with at least 90 days notice before the date of the increase. For notices for a lease renewal must contain an option for a 2-year lease renewal. And they also must include the rent for both years, keeping in mind that for regulated units, that rent would be the same because they are not allowed to increase the rent for multi-year leases. The third bullet point is not a requirement, but we highly recommend landlords to give out notices that correspond with the rent cycle. So for example, if the landlord sends a 90-day notice on March 29th, so before the rent is due on April 1st, that the notice would take effect on July 1st. However, if the landlord waited until April 2nd, till after the rent was due, that notice would not take effect until August 1st, so that tenants have the full 90-day, at least 90-day notice. Now, it's very important for tenants to remember that a rent increase is required to contain the current rent, your new rent, the percentage of the increase, the date of the proposed increase, and a statement. It must also include a statement informing you that that as a tenant, you have the right to ask DHCA to review any increase you feel may be out of line or excessive. If you receive a rent increase that is missing any of these things, that increase is not valid, and your landlord would be required to either amend it or issue a new one.
And it has to include a 2-year lease option.
Yes, it does, unless it is a MPDU unit. Those ones are different, but for all intents and for all the other things, it must include if it is a renewal. So this is a rent increase notice. If it's a rent increase notice and a renewal, then it would it must include the 2-year lease 2-year renewal option.
The only exception to that are for anything that requires an annual financial certification.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones that are accepted.
Yeah, that was my question, Sharon. Does these rules apply to tenants who have vouchers? Are the rules the same for them?
So I cannot speak to the specifics of like the program that is issuing the voucher. Some of them do have their own requirements. Like I pointed out, MPDU, they do not. Those units are not given the option for a 2-year lease renewal. I would have to again, I don't know the specifics. It would depend on the program requirements that are issuing the voucher to the tenant.
It's my understanding that if they have to do an annual financial certification, which they have to do for HOC, that they don't have to offer the 2-year lease.
Yes.
But I do believe that you can be in a rent stabilized apartment building and receive a voucher. That's a different scenario.
Yes, that's a different scenario.
Sure. Just to clarify, MPDUs are not or are exempt from the rent stabilization, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
So I'll talk briefly about troubled or at-risk properties. So if you are living in a property that is designated as troubled or at risk, your landlord is not permitted to increase the rent by any amount at any time while they have that designation. The troubled and at-risk property list was released this month on October 1st. If you live in a property that was designated as troubled or at risk, the landlord is not permitted to increase the rent at any time. The lease, excuse me. However, if you were previously on the list, and then when the list came out on October 1st, the property was no longer on the list, meaning that your landlord was now compliant, the landlord would be permitted to increase the rent at the time of a lease renewal, as long as they were in line with the rent stabilization regulation. So as I mentioned, if a landlord is troubled or at risk, they may not increase the rent with that designation. They do have specific processes to get that designation removed. It is, for troubled properties, a mix of correcting the violations and reinspection and submitting specific documents. At-risk properties must correct the violations and undergo reinspection. Now, if the landlord is unable to meet the conditions to remove that designation due to the financial inability, then they would be able to apply for a fair return increase. I'll speak about this a little bit more in a couple slides, but if they go throughout this process and are able to show that whatever they're bringing in as profit is not enough to cover the operating expenses of the building, they can apply for a fair return, and if approved, the landlord will be able to increase the rent by an amount that DHCA will decide, and they will still have that troubled or at-risk designation. However, if they go throughout the process and they are denied for their fair return, the landlord will still have that troubled or at-risk designation and will still not be able to increase their rent. So what I wanted to talk about now were some of the options for landlords to increase rent outside or seek outside of the allowable increase or to seek specific exemptions. So the first one would be for capital improvement. So capital improvements are any renovations or alterations to the property that are outside of regular maintenance or repair. So these things, examples of capital improvements are things such as like replacing appliances, replacing or fixing the HVAC system, replacing a new roof, or fixing the elevator, things like that. So if a landlord can petition DHCA for a limited surcharge to cover the cost of the capital improvements. So we define the surcharge as an additional amount temporarily added to the monthly base rent of an approved capital improvement petition. The surcharge is not a part of the annual increase and does not change over the year. So that means that if a surcharge is added to your rent, it will not be factored in when the landlord calculates your annual rent increase. And that surcharge will stay the same for the time that it's attached to your unit. So how does a capital improvement affect my rent? So the surcharge will not take effect until after all the improvements are completed. So until all the renovations or repairs are done. Now, if this is a building-wide capital improvement, so say, for example, the landlord is replacing the HVAC system or repairing the plumbing system, the cost, so the surcharge would be divided between all the units in the building, and that surcharge would be prorated over at least 96 months. So the full cost would be spread out equally amongst those 96 months. And the surcharge itself may not exceed 20% of the current base rent. For capital improvements that apply to specific units or part of the building. So say, for example, the landlord, replace the windows on the bottom floor or replace the balconies on the top floors or things like that. The surcharge would then only be divided by the affected units and prorated over 60 months. So that full surcharge would be broken up evenly over at least 60 months and would not exceed at least 15% of the base rent. So if your landlord decides to go through or to submit a capital improvement petition, they are required to let you know once they file that petition, and they're also required to let you know when they are approved, for that surcharge as well. So the other two things I wanted to talk about briefly were fair return and substantial renovation.
Excuse me, Sharon, when you say that the price would stay with the tenant, how long do they have to pay that amount? Is it
So
as long as they are in that unit or?
yeah. So it would be attached to the unit, not to the tenant. As you see here for the second and third bullets, for how it affects rent. So the surcharge would be prorated, so spread out over at least 96 months. If it was for the full property or if it was for a specific unit, say, like I said, like I mentioned, replacing the windows on one floor, that full amount would be prorated, so split over at least 60 months. So, and that the tenants will only have to pay it as long as they were in that unit. So if a tenant was in a unit that had a surcharge, but they moved out, they moved to a different property, they wouldn't be responsible for paying the remainder of that surcharge. That surcharge would be would then be transferred to whoever the new tenant would be moving in, and that surcharge would be should be separately marked as not as something outside of the base rent.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So as I mentioned, the next two things I want to touch on are fair return and substantial renovation. So I mentioned fair return when we were talking about troubled and at-risk properties. So landlords have a right to fair return on their property. If the operating income is unable to be maintained due to high operating expenses, the landlord may petition for a fair rent increase, for a fair return rent increase above the annual rent increase allowance. So a landlord may only petition for a fair return increase if they have used all of the banked amounts for all of their units. So that banked amount concept I talked about, they must exhaust all of that before applying for a fair return. Now, if your landlord goes through this process and is approved, approved for a fair return increase, that increase must be implemented within 12 months from the date of approval or at the time of a lease renewal, whichever is later. If that increase is more than 15%, the landlord must spread it out over consecutive years. They may not take that full over 15% at one time. And again, like the capital improvement petition, a landlord must notify the tenants when they choose to apply and file for the application, and they must inform the tenants when they are approved for the fair return increase. And the fair return increase would be is only valid for 12 months. So if your landlord went through this, they would only be permitted that increase, which would be over the allowable annual rent increase. They would only be allowed that for 12 months. The next one I wanted to talk about was substantial renovation. So if your landlord conducts a large scale renovation, so this would be something bigger, bigger or at a larger scale than a capital improvement. If the improvement enhances the building's value and costs at least 40% of the building's value, the landlord may petition for a 23-year exemption. So if your landlord goes through this, of course, like fair return and capital improvement, they must notify you when they file and submit their application. And they also must notify you once they receive the decision back from DHCA. So if your landlord is approved for this substantial renovation exemption, it must be implemented within 12 months, but they must wait until the lease expires for that unit. So they must wait until the new lease or for a lease renewal to implement that exemption. So for example, if you are living in a unit and your lease ends in September and your landlord was approved for a substantial renovation exemption in October, they must wait until the end of your lease in December before applying that exemption to your unit. So we're almost finished here. So I want to talk about fees. So our executive regulation limits the type of fees a landlord may charge and also the amount. The fees on this screen here are the only fees that a landlord may automatically charge across the board. So I won't go through all of them individually, but I did want to touch on some of them. For the pet fee, the regulation allows for a refundable pet deposit of up to $300 and a $25 monthly pet fee per pet. The pet deposit, of course, must be returned within 45 days after the end of tenancy, minus any pet-related damages should they occur. The point I wanted to stress here was that DHCA will allow for an increase for the pet fee and monthly, for the pet deposit and the monthly pet fee based on the CPIU, which we will publish on our website. Also, I wanted to touch on the motor vehicle and motorcycle parking fees. So if your landlord currently charges for parking, be that reserved, unreserved, surface lot, or garage, they are permitted to continue charging that. However, moving forward, they may only increase that fee once per year, and that increase is limited to the CPIU. If you live in a property where your landlord was not charging for parking and they decided for whatever reason, hey, maybe we got a new garage, hey, something happened, we now would like to charge a parking fee, your landlord must first apply and be approved by DHCA. And if they are approved, the parking fee may be no more than 10% of the lowest base rent of a regulated unit on their property. So while these fees here are the ones that a landlord can just automatically charge, we do allow for landlords to charge for optional services. These optional services are not regulated, meaning that landlords can charge however much they want. However, a tenant must choose to enroll or opt into these services. A landlord may not automatically enroll a tenant into these optional services and charge them that fee. So examples of optional fees would be swimming pool access, a gym membership. Some of the newer properties have a dog park or a pet spa. An optional service may not include any service that impacts the entire community and may not include any service that's required to ensure unit access, maintenance, or lease compliance. Two examples of that I like to use would be the extermination or pest fee. Oftentimes we've seen tenants who have, a $4, $8, I've seen as high as $12 monthly pest fee to cover the cost of the property's regular extermination services. Because that's a service that impacts the entire community and is required to maintain the maintenance of the property, landlords are no longer permitted to charge that. Another example of a fee that's no longer permitted would be a technology fee. Some of the properties have transitioned from the traditional lock and key into an electronic key fob swiping to get into the units, and as a result have been charging a tech fee or a fob fee. Those things are no longer permitted just off the basis that you cannot charge a tenant to gain access to a unit for which they're already paying rent for. So for all the fees, new fees may not be charged during the lease term unless they are for the optional services that a tenant chooses to enroll in. Fees may only be increased once every 12 months and require a 90-day written notice. Landlords of rent stabilized units must comply with the limits. We allowed them a grace period up until, I believe this would be 2 days ago on October 21st, we gave them 90 days to adjust their systems, adjust whatever billing they're doing to make sure that they comply. Some of the landlords took that as they have 90 days. They have 90 days until they have to. Some of those landlords took that information and decided that they could increase the rents, the fees above what was allowed. And as long as they did so before October 21st, that those fees would still stand. that is incorrect. So if your landlord has implemented a new fee or raised a fee after July 23rd, so after regulation went into effect, and those fees are either not permitted or above the limit of what the regulation allows, those fees must be removed or reduced because they do not comply with regulation. So the last thing I wanted to touch on before I end for today is the rental housing portal. So DHCA has developed a rental housing portal that is aimed to allow tenants, landlords, and the general public to access rental housing information. We are requiring all landlords, whether they have rent stabilized units or exempt units, to register their rents for all their units. Our goal here for tenants is so that they have a resource to be able to check and see, am I being charged the right rent? So, hey, so maybe you're applying to a property, they give you this rent. Our hope is that by using this, you can go to, you say, hey, they're charging me $2,400. Let me go check the public rent, the rental portal. I can type in the address, I can go to the unit, and I can see what they were charging for rent in the previous year and see if that matches up to the allowable increase. I can see, when this property, I can see more information about this property to make sure that I'm being charged the right rent, to make sure that I'm being charged the appropriate fee amounts and things like that. So we do, I will make sure that I provide Matt with the links for the links to the public rental portal. We have a user guide and we have a training library with a couple videos that will show you how to navigate the portal and how to use some of the resources. So this actually concludes my presentation today. Again, thank you all so much for the opportunity to speak with you all. If you have any questions, please call 311. I will put our intake email into the chat as well. That's another option We have our program specialists and our other staff in the Office of Rent Stabilization who monitor that email daily and will be sure to get back to you. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to pass it over to Paulina, who will finish the question and answer period. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Sharon. And Paulina, before you start, I just want to give some comment from the Renters Alliance perspective. And I know there's a lot of specific details. Just a little history here. The Renters Alliance, of course, has been urging a rent stabilization program since we were founded in 2010. However, this rent stabilization bill is not everything we wanted by a long shot. We were facing double-digit rent increases across the county. Some of them as high, believe it or not, over 200%. We even saw one just recently at 70%. And so we were seeing common rent increases at 6, 7, 8, 12, 15, 20% that were pricing people out of their homes. So having a 6% cap on those buildings that are covered by this legislation is a great first step, and it is progress. So we are very pleased about that. However, we are not so pleased about the amendments that Council Member Don Lutke put in. One was having the 23-year exemption. We support the principle behind it, which is that if someone or an entity invests $100 million or $200 million to build a new apartment building, they should make their money back and make a profit. We get that. Any reasonable person would think that's appropriate. But how long it takes to make your profit back, make your money back and your profit, we're not sure that that's 23 years. We think that was kind of arbitrary. So in our view, that's something that might need to be fixed down the road. The other is that small landlords are exempt, 2 or fewer units. We've never really understood why, if you're a landlord renting 2 units or a landlord renting 100 units, why you should have any less responsibility for community stability and the quality of your home. So these are things that we are concerned about. We're also concerned about some of the things that Sharon went through in terms of the limitations on fees. It concerned me immediately to hear that it's 10% of the lowest base rent is how much you can raise for parking. Some of the apartment buildings around here have a base rent of $2,700. So that could be a $270 parking fee. So that's, also concerning. But Sharon and Paulina represent the law as it is with Montgomery County. And so we'll work within the law, of course, to inform you, but it's also the Renters Alliance role to try to improve it down the road. And it's also all of your role to come out and support our efforts when the time comes to speak to our legislators about improvements. We're just getting started with this legislation, so let's get comfortable with it and understand it, but understand that the Renters Alliance and all of our allies wants even stronger rent stabilization. So Paulina, go for it.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Sharon. So I've been answering the questions in the chat, and I see there's some questions in the Q&A. We probably should have specified where we wanted everybody to put their questions. All right, so there's 3 questions that I see right now in the Q&A. What about holding or reservation fees? So those fees would be prior to your lease. So the property can't charge it because it's not a monthly fee and it's prior to the lease starting. So that it still stays. This is addressed to Matt, but I can probably answer this. Details on the mailed lease issue. If this is a question, so multiple questions regarding the requirements to mail the letter, because I know nowadays people have most of the communication via email or portal, but the requirement has been there for over 10 years, I believe. It's not a new requirement. It's something that has been established by the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, and the landlord is required to mail the letter via first-class U.S. mail or hand deliver, and the tenant must sign for it. So just sending an email, slipping it under the door, putting it in a portal, they can do all those things in addition to sending it via U.S. Post Service. If it was not mailed, it was not sent.
Paulina, let me just add to
yes.
that in terms of what we've seen, that generally speaking, the most important thing is that you get 90 days notice before any rent increase kicks in. So we've seen some cases where the judge is like, did you receive it? You got it by email or something that's not quite what the law says. The most important thing is that you got the 90 days notice and that it includes the elements that Sharon had outlined earlier in her presentation. Those are the most key things, but you're right, Paulina, those other things also apply, but the judges tend to be flexible provided it includes the elements required and that it's at least 90 days in advance. So just keep those things in mind, but technically what Paulina is saying is the law.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, so the landlord can, of course, send you an email and do other methods such as portal or just slipping under the door, because we have gotten questions from the landlords. Well, how can we prove that they received the notice? How can we prove? Well, if you are doing 3 different ways, they're going to get it, but it must be mailed. Let's see. It seems landlords raise rents according to the income of individual tenants, i.e. people they know make more. Oh, where'd it go? Make more, get bigger increases. Is that legal? So the max is 6%. So if they want to increase somebody by 2% or 5%, they can certainly do so, but they cannot go over the limit, which is currently 6%. And once again, this is for rent stabilized properties only. This does not apply to newer buildings that are exempt. So if the building was built in 2015, this will not apply. HOC properties, so it will all depend on the program, but for HOC, I believe that's the project-based subsidies. So the project-based are exempt. The unit-based subsidies are not. So Section 8 is not exempt, but if there is a subsidy on the unit itself, meaning it cannot be rented to anybody else except for the voucher holders, except for low and medium income individuals, then it is exempt because it has to follow the regulations of the program. The Blairs refinanced their properties for $1 or $2 billion last year. I believe why should tenants have to pay for improvements to building from the 1960s? So if they try to do capital improvement, because it sounds like $1 or $2 billion. So it sounds like a capital, I'm sorry, not a capital improvement. That would be the substantial renovation, because the substantial renovation has to be at least 40% of the value of the building. And they must be approved for that. So if the landlord doesn't, there is a question about capital improvements. If, let me read that question real quick. If an appliance is not working and is replaced, can the landlord charge tenant a capital improvement fee? And another question was, let me see, give me just a second. There are a couple of questions about the capital improvements. Let me make sure I'm getting all those questions answered. It was early on. Give me just a second.
Paulina, I think, by the
Basically,
way,
there was,
sorry,
yeah, there is a question saying that we see our landlords doing all of these capital improvements and they're not notifying us. So if the landlord does capital improvements without getting first their application approved by DSCA, they are not allowed to charge you the surcharge. So they can do all of the improvements they want. They can change all of your appliances. They can paint all of your rooms, get you new windows. But if they were not approved by DSCA, they cannot raise the rent over that 6%. And we do encounter landlords who are saying, well, I've done this, this, and that. Well, I'm sorry, but the law passed and you must apply. So that would be for capital improvements. For substantial renovations, it has to be 40% of the value of the building, but it can be the renovations that they have done in the last 23 years. So if they have done renovations in the last 23 years, they can file for that exemption. Matt, you look like you want to say something.
Can you describe also, I mean, I think it's important for people to understand that this is an application process. It's not automatic. Correct. That the director and his team will need to review it and decide whether or not this was maintenance that the property owner should have put into place as part of common maintenance versus a genuine good faith renovation. So there is a room for consideration as to whether or not this is valid in the first place. And as Shirin pointed out in her presentation, there's a part of that where the tenants need to be notified that the landlord is putting in such a application or petition. And if you disagree with that and say, wait a second, the landlord's putting in for renovations for an exemption, but that really didn't happen, or we disagree with that, or it really should have been maintenance that they should have been responsible for, that we've been asking them to do for a long time, for example, and they're finally getting around to it and acting not in good faith to circumvent the rent stabilization program, then renters in that community also have a voice to raise to the director of housing.
So we do not have actually in our regulations that tenants can appeal, just so you know, that it's not something that's in the, we of course will listen to the tenants because that input would be very valuable. But just to repeat what Matt just said, it is application process. They have to submit all the receipts, showed us that they must assess that surcharge. And it is a limited surcharge, just so there's understanding too. It's not immediate raise in the rent, so they cannot charge you an extra $1,000, say, and your rent automatically goes up $1,000. It's a limited surcharge that is divided evenly among the units that receive that capital improvement. So if only 20 units receive capital improvement, the total amount will be divided equally among 20 units. If it was building-wise, it would be divided building-wide. But it is a surcharge, it is limited. They can only charge, I believe, 60 months for partial and 96 months for full. So after that amount of time, they must stop charging the surcharge unless they applied for extension. And once again, they have to apply for it, they have to get approved. It's a process, and there is a notice of tenants every time they apply and the decision. They must notify tenants within 5 days of applying for the petition. So that is something that has to happen. They must notify it. It's one of the conditions.
Paulina, it's just because I heard the discussion about appliances, and I want to be clear that that it's not intended when a stove breaks or a refrigerator breaks or some other thing, that when they replace a stove or replace a microwave, that comes with a unit as part of the appliances that are the responsibility of the landlord, that kind of replacement and maintenance is not the kind of renovation that is to be applied for. Is that correct?
Correct, especially if it's just one or two, because those capital improvement petitions, they are extensive, they are very complicated. It will take them longer to apply and to be approved for one than to just replace it, because they would have to first apply and get approved before they even replace that oven. So if they already replaced it, well, sorry, that is just, something that would be normal wear and tear. And the definition of capital improvement, I just pulled out our bill, it's a structural alteration required under federal, state, or county law. So it has to be more than just, I fixed this oven, I changed a microwave. So permanent structural alterations to regulated unit intended to enhance the value of the unit. So something that's a normal wear and tear, I repainted the walls, I changed the carpet, that is not a capital improvement. It would have to be multiple units. Unless they want to just do one unit, and that would be way too much work for just one unit. Let me see, I see a couple of questions. Package locker fee. Okay, I saw somebody mention package locker fee. The landlord does not allow us to pick up ourselves except into these boxes that we have to pay for. There is no concierge or provision to receive parcels except in the lockers. We have raised this fee with the landlord, and they don't plan to change the policy or the separate fee. So we can submit your. So it's a so similar question, and maybe it's the same person, but it sounds like it was an annual fee. So if the tenants already paid that fee, it is not a monthly fee that they can stop charging. They would have to stop charging that for any new tenant that comes in. But if it was an annual fee that was already paid for, then they cannot ask for it at the renewal. And it sounds like from what we have heard from other tenants is there is no other option for them to receive their mail, and they have to pay it. And unfortunately, that is the case. They can optionally say you have the option to have this package locker fee, but we do not provide you an alternative. So you will have to still stuck with paying that locker fee. The only thing that is changing is that now it's optional. So if you are getting Amazon packages, you can send them to Whole Foods where they have Amazon lockers. Or if it's USPS, maybe they have a service where you can pick it up from the USPS store rather than having them delivered to your house. So there are options to go around it, but if you want the convenience of having the package delivered to you and they do not have an alternative way for you to get your package, unfortunately, they will still charge you, but now it's going to be optional. So they cannot say you have to pay this $50, $60 annual fee. How do you know how many units your landlord owns? So you can go, I dropped the link earlier to eProperties, and if you enter your address or the name of the community, the information will open up on the next page. And I believe once you have the owner's name, you can go on as that, and I will have to provide all that information step by step, because landlords do get tricky with how they're labeling their properties. Sometimes they put it into the family, so it looks like the person only owns one or two, and then the properties are spread out among family members. But when we're talking about smaller landlords, we would have to go, what we usually do in my office, we look at as that, and we look at the information to see how many properties are associated with the owner.
Well, I think that was the And I appreciate you clarifying that at the end there, that your office then will step in and help with that, because I've noticed that in eProperty, there's the new link that comes
Yeah.
up will be a unit by unit breakdown, which is exciting and overwhelming at the same time as a user, just to let you know. Like I get it from a legal standpoint. It's great to know which units are regulated and which are not, but from just a general public user standpoint, it's like, wow, what was one building is now like 300 units that I got to click on. So can you just your office is a resource for understanding that, right? Is
Yes,
that
absolutely. So, I know Sharon briefly spoke about the new rental housing portal. So we launched in September 16th, we launched a new rental housing portal. And this portal is for all of the landlords, exempt and rent stabilized. And there are couple of different access for this portal. So landlords have their own access, and then there's the tenant and the public side. So the landlord would not have a due date by which they have to enter all the information, but they are required to enter information for each and every single one of their units into the portal. So that includes the rent amount that they're charging. Every time there is a new lease signed, they must enter that information into the portal. Every time there is renewal, they must update the information in the portal and also enter all of the fees. If they filed for a new kind of a petition, we update it, we get the petition, and my office updates that there is a petition for that property. The reason for it is because we want the full transparency. We want all the tenants to know this is an, I'm sure some tenants are not going to like that their neighbors know how much they're paying, but also it's full transparency. The tenant can view that information and click on their building. They can click on their unit number and see, okay, my landlord is stating I am currently paying X amount. And if it is,
And that's required. That's a requirement of the property owners.
right, so we do
Okay.
not have, it's going to be a process. It's going to probably take at least a couple of years for all of the landlords to convert to this method, because what we're trying to do is, instead of doing annual reporting, do it on a rolling basis, because that would give us a more accurate information. So they are required to enter that data. It's new. We're helping out landlords because some landlords have over 1,000 units and they have to enter in that information for every single unit, and it's two-step process. So it will take them some time to register every unit. But we're hoping in a few years we will have majority of the units in Montgomery County registered, so each tenant can go click on the property, click on the unit, and see, okay, here's my rent history. This is how much it says I was paying. This is how much I'm paying right now. And if there are any issues, they can call us and say, well, my landlord is reporting he's charging me $1,200, but he's really charging me $1,500. So we'll have that level of transparency where it will be easily checked by the tenant what their landlord is reporting to us. And because the landlord can report to us that they only charge $1,200, which would be like 6% increase, but in reality, they increase them by 10%. And the tenant will be able to see that. So we do have that on eProperties. We do have that button. We have a few landlords that are already registered and they already entered their information, so they're on the top of that. And Sharon and I are working on outreach plan to more landlords to get that information out there and to help them out. So yes, it is exciting, but if anybody has questions or confused about the amount of properties their landlord owns or how it works, always reach out to us. Let me go back to the questions. How do we know if the capital improvements were approved? Your landlord must send a notification. So within 5 days of applying, they have to send notification. Within 5 days of approval, they must send a notification. They're a fairly big loophole to be exempt. Well, the petitions are pretty complicated, so it's not exactly a loophole, and they have to actually prove that they're doing those improvements and renovations. what if resident was not notified regarding application process for substantial library renovation? There will be, then the landlord will be in violation. So that means they did not follow the regulations and they would be denied for their application. And we would have to put a stop to that if they're already approved, if there's never a notice. Where
Lena,
and when,
just for clarity on that, I don't think it means that they are denied the application. It means they just have to start over in terms of notifying the tenants and then resubmitting the application. Is that correct?
right, so they would have to start the whole process over. Where and when will a listing be provided for tenants of rental apartment properties under rent stabilization? So we do not have currently a list. I'm asking everyone I can to see what we can do our IT, because it will be on rolling basis due to the 23-year exemption. So next year there will be more buildings, and then after that more buildings. So the way we usually check if the property falls under rent stabilization is we go on eProperty, we type in the address, and we look at the year built. So if the year built is over 23 years ago, and it's within our jurisdiction, it's not in the city of Rockville, city of Gators, or city of Tacoma Park, then it will be under rent stabilization.
Melina, will you all be putting out a list of non-exempted properties anyway? I mean, at least we know with perhaps an asterisk that says there's a bunch that we're not sure of, but here's the ones we are sure of.
We do not have any kind of a list right now, stabilized or exempt. So we're working with IT to see if there would be a method for us to kind of just look at, okay, give me a list of all of the properties that were built over 23 years ago, or in the last 5 years, in the last 20 years. But currently we do not have a list, but a tenant, anybody can just go on eProperties, enter their address, and I believe it's under licensing where you can see the year built.
But you're
And also
working on it.
apartments.com, usually apartments.com list year built for the properties.
Okay, but you guys are working on it, so down the
Yes,
road.
yes, trying, because that's a question that we get asked all the time. Can we have a list of the rent stabilized properties? Just to make sure I understand, your office will consider any comments that tenants submit to you on a petition for capital. Not any comments. Like I said, in our current regulations, we do not allow a comment period for petitions. So if tenants say, we do not want this renovation done, our building is fine as it is, it's not something that we will review it and we will discuss it. We have not received a single petition as of today. So nobody has applied for any substantial renovation, fair return, or capital improvement. But it will all depend on what the comments are and what the circumstances are, because per regulations, the comments is not something that we're taking into account for approval. But it all will depend what those comments are, because if a landlord did not fix any issues and it should have been something that would be a standard wear and tear, then yes, we will have to take a deeper look at what it is that they're saying that they're doing, and if it's actually the information that we're looking for and just not normal wear and tear. We do have a list that we created that we will be going through to make sure that it falls under capital improvements.
Well, and a similar question on the substantial renovation front, as far as what the kind of metric, if it goes toward the value of the place. I know y'all's director had kind of given some crazy examples of, you know, Golden whatever that wouldn't fall under that. But what about, is there tenant input on that front? Or is there a mechanism for that in that process?
So I think it goes back to if it's a normal wear and tear, or because we will go by the definition. So the capital improvement would be permanent structural alterations to regulate units. So if they're changing HVAC system, if it's actual structural, but you're saying that if it's just it's okay, I got two little kids that I keep pushing away. So if it's something that's a normal wear and tear, then we would view it on case-by-case basis.
I
Alright,
think
so let me
it's
just-
worth noting, Paulina, the reason why when we were involved in the comment period of the rent regulations, that we really urged, and it was included, that the tenants be informed of an application. And so while there may not be in the regulation a formal appeal process, there is an opportunity to be notified that these things are happening, that an application is going in, and we're all able to pick up the phone or call 311 or send a letter or contact a council member or write a letter to the director of the housing and say, hey, look, we think we've got an issue with this application. So you all are expected to exercise your rights to do so if you have a concern. And we expect, of course, that the director, right now, Scott Bruton, but we don't know who the directors might be down the road, will take that comment into account.
Thank you. Yeah, so we will not turn down any comment, but like Matt said, we do not currently have a process, an appeal process, or something that is going to be tenants against the landlord. So, and of course, that can also be brought up to the landlord. So let me go back to the questions. I see I have there 18 new messages. Mandatory $7 a month service fee for the company that reads bills for individual water meters in your exempt building. So if it's an exempt building, they can charge any fee they want, unfortunately.
Actually, Paulina, I'm not sure of that. I think that they can only charge $1 as an administrative fee
route,
per
yep.
utility. But I'm not sure about it, whether that's county or state law, but I do know that it's $1 for if you have a third party biller, that to prepare that bill for water and sewage, it can only be $1. So if you're getting charged more than that, we urge you to contact the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs and file a complaint.
Okay, thank you. Do landlords have report tenants rent in the new portal prior to September 2020, even September 2025 maybe? We do not have currently a due date by which the landlords have to comply. Like I said, we expect it to be a process that will take a couple of years because we're currently asking them to fill this out on the renewal. So anytime somebody renews, they have to go to the portal. So it will take a couple of years as people are renewing and they are getting used to the portal. If somebody opts for a 2-year lease today, then 2 years from now, the landlord can still only raise the rent 6% from what it was 2 years prior. Is that correct understanding? Yes and no. So they received an increase for, right, currently it's 6%. 2 years down the road, they can raise the rent for the allowable amount. So right now, 6%. In 2 years, it can be 5.8, it can be 4.3. You just can never go over 6%. So 6% is the cap. And currently, the CPIU is 3.3%. The cap is 6%. I'm sorry, the allowable rent is CPIU plus 3%. And so it will be 6.3%, but we cap it at 6%. Now, they can bank that second year. So they can bank the amount. So if they were allowed to charge you $20 extra for that second year, they can bank that $20 for your renewal. But they can never go over 10% for the allowable amount plus bank amount. So you live there for 2 years, you received increase year 1. Your 2 years expired, they say, okay, the new allowable amount is 5.8%. I can increase you by 5.8%. And also I have this amount that I did not increase you by during year 2. So they can add that banked amount, but it can never go over 10%, the allowable plus the banked.
Can I chime in?
Go
We're
ahead, David.
talking about regulated units here, the non-exempt units, right? And that was something that I caught at the beginning of this webinar that I probably should have caught before, which is that then I thought the regulations clarified the 2-year lease thing for kind of all units, but no, you have to have the amount laid out for rent for both years that regulation only applies to regulated units, right? And then
Correct.
so if there's a 2-year lease signed with a certain amount, and then 12 months later an increase comes, if it's a non-regulated unit, that is okay then still, is what you're saying.
That is
Right.
correct. So the unregulated, the exempt properties, they can still do the annual increases. The regulated properties cannot raise the rent in that second year.
So I
Okay,
want to
and then
thank
I think-
you. Go ahead. Sorry, David.
Oh, no, please.
Yeah, we are running out of time, and we know that there's always going to be questions, and people are still going to need to understand this legislation over time. But I do want to ask you, Paulina and Shirin, to close on something as we move on to the next section here. What is the enforcement mechanism, and how will that work? So a tenant says they got an increase that's too high. A tenant says that they've got a fee that's not within the law. Assuming that they're going to reach out to the Office of Rent Stabilization, and what is your enforcement mechanism, and what will happen?
So after a tenant reaches out to us and says, my landlord is charging me over 6%. So we send them the alleged violation form, they have to fill it out, and then we contact the landlord and to let them know that we have been contacted by a tenant, and they sent us a copy of your increased notice. You are not complying with the law. So the first thing we do is trying to mediate. Basically, we're trying to say like, hey, this was a violation. So it could be the notice was sent out less than 90 days. It could be the increase was over. So the first thing we do is try to correct the action. Maybe they did not know that there's a new rent stabilization laws in effect. They were not aware. They overcharged. So we try to work with them first. Now, if they do not respond, if they do not comply, then we send out a notice of violation, and then we send out a citation. The citations are up to $500, which can be assessed $500 per day. So we do have right now a couple of cases that we're working where the landlords are not being responsive, so they will be getting notice of violation, and if they do not comply, they will be getting citations and will be going to court. But the first step that we're doing is contacting the landlord to let them know that, hey, this notice of increase is faulty due to XYZ. So please reissue a new notice and make sure it's corrected with a new 90-day period.
Great. And another thing that we'd like to fix, we want to see it $1,000 and not $500. Some people find that a little bit low. But then, of course, if they refuse to pay the citation, then the county may very well take them to court. So I think that's the ultimate process. I want to thank both of you, Paulina and Shirin. This is mighty work. It's detailed work. This is a work in progress, folks. The legislation may be what it is, but having people understand it, having the landlords understand it, having the tenants understand it is going to take a while. And of course, the Renters Alliance position is it's still imperfect and we'd like to see it improved. So all of us have a lot of things to do going forward. But we are especially pleased and grateful that Paulina and Shirin could be with us to share this information. Unfortunately, we're going to have to ask them back again and again to do this over and over again over the coming year because people are still going to need to hear this information, basic information, and will undoubtedly have new questions and concerns as we work through putting the program in place. But I want to say thank you, Paulina, and thank you, Shirin. And grateful that you're here, and you're welcome to stay for the end, or you can go have dinner or take care of your kids or whatever's next.
Thank you, Matt. And
Thank you,
just real quick, I saw a question that I want to address real quick about how standard protected through the citation process if the office will provide relocation support. Just because your landlord is getting citation does not mean you need to move out. So I just want to make it clear. So they will have to go through the citation process, but no, there should not be any kind of relocation required unless it's a special circumstance. All right. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
All right, let's move on. We only have a few minutes left. I had a number of things to talk about, but it seems that we don't have a whole lot of time. So I'm going to leave this now to my staff to cover a couple of things that we always cover. Emily, you want to start?
Yeah, so we heard about how to reach out to Rent Stabilization if you have a complaint for their office. But the other two major kind of complaints that we always talk about are to code enforcement and to the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. So code enforcement complaints have to do with the maintenance and condition of your property, broken appliances, pests, bugs, those kinds of things. Those all go to code enforcement. You can either call 311 or you can fill out the link online, which we'll put in the chat. And you can also contact us if you're confused on or need guidance on which complaint to file. So they'll assign, yeah, thank you, Tim, just put in the chat. They'll assign an inspector to come look at see if the code has been violated. And if they determine, these appliances are broken, this needs to be replaced, whatever the situation may be, they'll require the landlord to fix it. And then the other kind of complaint to the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs will have to do with your lease and your ledger. You're getting charged late fees, but you paid on time. Things like that. But now with the new Office of Rent Stabilization, there is going to be that distinction. If it has to do with the increase you're receiving or the kinds of fees in your rent stabilized building, that's going to go to rent stabilization. But if it's just something to do with your lease and ledger outside of the increase, having a problem with your landlord, things like that, that'll all go to landlord tenant. Same thing, you can call 311 for both options, and there's also an online form for both.
And of course, you can always contact us in between, and we'll give you some idea on what steps to take. Sometimes you don't need to get to the point of filing a complaint, but we'll certainly guide you there if you do. And Tim, you want to do tenants?
Sorry, Matt, I forgot to say you always have to try to resolve it with your property manager first. So if the dishwasher is broken, don't just call 311 right away. Put in a maintenance request in your portal if that's how you do it, or go to the office and request it. And if they don't fix it in a reasonable amount of time, or they're not willing to fix it, or you're not getting a response in a reasonable amount of time, that's when you can escalate it.
Thank you. Tim, tenants associations.
Yeah, so tenants associations are pretty much, if you want to form a group with your neighbors in your building, that's what tenant association is, and it addresses issues that have to deal with your living condition, right? And so we highly encourage people we think everyone should have a tenants association in their building. You can meet as much as once a month, as little as once every 3 months. And then you can talk about things like if they are things that aren't part of the law but would be nice to have, like if there is like if there is
a new neighbor. How about a new neighbor?
Yeah, a new neighbor. Okay, so if if you have a new neighbor, it'd be like good to welcome them. So it's a way of building community, so you can have parties, you can have get-togethers, but you can also kind of talk about addressing issues as a group to rather than as an individual, because I know sometimes it's kind of daunting to complain all the time about an issue, and you feel like you might be singled out, and the management might not, you think that they might not believe you. But if your tenant association is complaining about something, then there's got to be at least a couple people who are going through the same things, and feels it's there's strength in numbers, right? So that's one of the things that we highly encourage people to do. And if you want to get started with one, we're happy to help you. We'll come to your first meeting. We'll buy pizza for the first meeting only, and we'll help you get that started. But yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out.
And we'll also help print flyers and do door-to-door outreach for you and help get people to those meetings. So by all means, reach out to us. If you haven't seen us in your building with a flyer under your door, you can also reach out to us and invite us to come over. We've got two young men here, Max Wilberg and Brian Piat, who are our new foot soldiers helping to distribute literature with the Maryland Service Year program, not to mention all of us who need the exercise. So, we are doing that. So if your building has not been touched by the Renters Alliance already and you want us there, invite us and we'll organize something with you to get to your building. David, we have also another
Oh,
program.
just before, I just want to note on the tenants association, even if you want to start one, it doesn't mean you have to lead it, right? Like you don't have to be running it, it just takes, if you just think there should be a tenants association, we could try to organize it, and hopefully other people can step up and and lead it. It doesn't necessarily have to be you if you want to start it.
Good info. David.
Yes, to tie it to Tim's message, strength in numbers is key across many fronts. Retaliation from landlords, sadly, is a real thing that we see for people just trying to get the services that Emily and Tim have been talking about, or just organize in the basic ways that the law permits. Sometimes we do see retaliation, or I know Paulina was just talking about you shouldn't have to relocate when you're filing a rent stabilization complaint, right? But until we have just cause protection, which we don't have yet, landlords can just non-renew folks without stating a reason, and we need to be honest that retaliation can be a real thing, and having a network of neighbors that you can rely on for this sort of thing is huge for that. But then I want to talk about legal resources too. The state has set aside money for access to counsel in evictions, meaning when you go down to court, there are lawyers available. I'm going to put the links in the chat in a minute for the legal service providers. Right now, it's Maryland Legal Aid and CASA and the Homeless Persons Representation Project, HPRP, provide legal representation same day in court or ahead of time. That's why we're going to put their numbers in here if you're facing eviction. So please do reach out. There's also a self-help desk that you can go to at the court in Rockville on the second floor. And we recommend that you take advantage of that as well if necessary. But please do, again, reach out as early as possible if you're, again, if you get a non-renewal notice or something like that, because the earlier the better as far as reaching out. So here is the information for those organizations.
Yes, the Access in Counsel and Evictions program is something we fought very hard for with our allies. It's funded. Unfortunately, there is some eligibility requirements that I do believe you have to be someone who can't afford a lawyer, basically. But if you're facing eviction, don't go to court alone without reaching out to see if you can get legal representation. And for God's sakes, always go to court if you are summoned to go to court to see if you have a defense, or if you can at least delay a process against you until you can get enough money to perhaps pay down what you owe if it's failure to pay rent and prevent the eviction. And last but not least, but very important, and by the way, Malek Demir, who's not commenting on any particular subject tonight, does manage our calendar, and we have a lot of events coming up. So stay tuned. We will announce those as we go. But Pat Beckham is here to give an important announcement on what's taking place tomorrow, if she can ever get off mute.
Yes, indeed. Tomorrow is early voting. We have 14 locations in the county. Voting, I can't stress enough, is our opportunity for us to voice our opinions. We need to get out and vote, folks. I found out last week the League of Women Voters put out a magazine that has an awful lot of good information about these candidates. So please remember to get out and vote. It starts tomorrow, early voting. And the election day, the regular general election day, is November the 5th. Please, people, it's important. Find out who can help you and your family. And you do that by researching the candidates.
And by voting. And since
There you go.
Since you left out a calendar item, Malek, what are we doing tomorrow? And you're on mute too. Follow Pat's lead. I know, right? Okay. Tomorrow, the Renters Alliance will be at the Silver Spring Civic Center from 4 to 7:30. with information and these great buttons that says I'm a renter and I vote. So if you want one, come visit us at our information table. The Renters Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We do not support any candidate or party. So we're not taking any position there, but we do urge everyone, especially the renter community, to vote. And with that, I want to thank everybody else, especially our staff, of course,
Vote,
Paulina,
vote, vote.
Melvin, and Sharon Wilkerson for being our special guests tonight. And with that, I say thank you